June 14th, 2014, 3:42 p.m., Panama City Beach, Florida. Summer crowds line the water. On one rented strip of sand, 36-year-old widow Rachel Miller watches her two adult daughters fold towels and gather their sunglasses. 10 minutes later, they are gone. Their phones sit in a tote bag. Their sandals are still in the sand. No one on the busy shoreline can say where they went or who they left with. 8 months later, in a quiet Gulf town miles away, one small detail will reopen everything. The question is what happened in that missing 10 minutes. Rachel's case file does not look rare on paper. Two women in their early 20s vanish from a tourist beach on a clear afternoon. No confirmed ransom call. No verified sighting. No vehicle tied to them leaving the area. Detectives from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or FDLE, log each interview and lead. The pages grow thicker, but the picture does not change. The investigation fans out through condos, hotels, and beach bars. License plate readers are checked. Social media accounts are pulled and preserved. Nothing shows a clear escape plan or a staged disappearance. Rachel refuses to accept that her daughters simply walked away from their lives. She calls, emails, and appears in every meeting she can. By February 2015, most of the early noise around the case has faded. One person who has not moved on is Detective Ben Carter, the FDLE investigator now assigned as primary. He believes something is wrong with the neat explanations. There is no body, no proof of life, and no clear crime scene. There is only a crowded beach and a time window measured in minutes. On a cool morning that month, Ben drives Rachel west along the coast to a smaller town called Bay Ridge. Officially, they are there to post fresh flyers and brief the local sheriff. Unofficially, Ben is looking for anything the first sweep might have missed. Rachel thinks this trip may be her last chance. She does not know yet that the water off Bay Ridge holds its own secrets. Before the beach, the Miller family story looked ordinary on paper. Rachel and Mark Miller lived in Tallahassee for almost 15 years. They raised two daughters who reached adulthood without serious trouble. Emily was 22, finishing a business degree at Florida State. Sophie was 20, halfway through a nursing program at a community college nearby. Both still lived at home to save money. In 2013, Mark's cancer changed everything. He was diagnosed with an aggressive lymphoma in March. By October, he had gone through chemotherapy twice. Medical records show repeated admissions at Tallahassee Memorial. Bank statements later entered into the case file document mounting bills and credit cards near their limits. Emily paused an internship offer in Atlanta to help at home. Sophie shifted clinical shifts so she could stay with her father at night. Mark died on May 30th, 2014, at 11:18 p.m., according to the death certificate. The house became quieter but busier in other ways. There were calls from insurance, letters about debt, and paperwork around the small life insurance policy Mark left behind. Rachel tried to keep a routine. She kept working full-time for the state. The sisters went back to summer classes. They ate dinner together, planned the memorial, and talked about how to honor Mark without spending money they did not have. One low-cost idea kept coming up. Mark had proposed to Rachel in Panama City Beach in the late 90s. The girls grew up hearing that story. In early June, phone records show a group text between the three women. Emily suggested driving down for a day, spreading a small amount of Mark's ashes at the waterline, and driving back the same night. Sophie agreed within minutes. Rachel hesitated, then wrote that it sounded right. If you follow cases where families disappear from crowded places, you know how fast plans like that can collapse. Stories like this often fade unless people keep asking what went wrong. On June 14th, they packed the car, left Tallahassee before noon, and drove west toward the Gulf, unaware that someone else might already be watching. On June 14th, 2014, the Miller women pulled into a public lot off Thomas Drive just after 3:10 p.m. in Panama City Beach. Parking records show Rachel paid at the kiosk at 3:13 p.m. using a debit card later logged in the case file. Cell tower data puts all three phones in the same small sector along the sand. They carried one cooler, one beach bag, and a small metal urn with a portion of Mark's ashes. A boardwalk camera captured them at 3:26 p.m., walking toward the water in swimsuits under loose shirts. It is the last confirmed video of Emily and Sophie together before they disappear. According to Rachel's later statement, they chose a spot near a blue lifeguard stand. She set the urn down, and the three of them stood in the shallows for less than 10 minutes. At 3:37 p.m., she placed the urn back in the bag, told the sisters she was going to refill drinks, and walked toward a snack bar. Her receipt marks the transaction at 3:44 p.m. In that 7-minute window, something happened at the waterline. When Rachel returned, the towels were still there. The cooler was still zipped shut. Emily's canvas backpack was propped against a chair. Sophie's phone showed an unread text from a classmate, timestamped 3:41 p.m. No one around them raised an alarm. Investigators later tracked down people visible in the background of photos taken that afternoon. A tourist from Georgia recalled seeing the two young women speaking to a man in a dark polo near the surf. A local teenager reported a golf cart-style utility vehicle moving slowly along the sand around the same time. The small resort camera that should have captured that section of beach was offline, its hard drive failing earlier that week. By early evening, Bay County deputies had cleared bathrooms, nearby shops, and the parking lot. There was no sign of a struggle, no abandoned car, and no record of the sisters boarding public transport. On paper, it looked like they had simply stepped out of the frame, until months later a pilot claimed he had seen them step into another world. By early February 2015, the Miller file had reached a quiet but dangerous stage. On February 9th, Detective Ben Carter signed out an FDLE vehicle in Tallahassee and drove west with Rachel toward a smaller Gulf town called Bay Ridge. Case notes list the purpose as a routine briefing with the local sheriff and a fresh push for tips. Unofficially, Ben wrote in his log that he wanted eyes near offshore private holdings, including a place called St. Aurelia Key. Bay Ridge had one small sheriff's substation a few blocks from the water. Sheriff Tom Davis had worked that stretch of coast for more than 20 years. Internal emails later obtained by investigators show he was viewed as cooperative but very protective of local businesses and donors. In the meeting room that afternoon, Ben laid out the basics of the disappearance. 2 adult daughters gone from Panama City Beach, no vehicle, no financial trail, and a mother who would not let the case die. Davis listened, nodded, and said all the right things. He agreed to let deputies post flyers around town and promised to keep an ear out at the marinas. Then he shifted the topic to tourism and spring break. Rachel sat at the table with a folder of printed posters, feeling the clock run again. When the meeting ended, Ben stayed behind to compare call logs, and Rachel walked alone down to the local beach access to start posting. What happened next did not come from any system FDLE controlled. At around 2:40 p.m., a single-engine seaplane came in low over the water and settled near the public pier. A few minutes later, the pilot walked up the sand toward Rachel. His name was Jake Lawson, a 38-year-old charter pilot based out of a small airfield inland. He told her he recognized Emily and Sophie from the poster in her hand. Jake said that earlier that day, he had flown over St. Aurelia Key on a sightseeing run. On the shoreline below one of the villas, he saw 2 young women with several older men. Their ages, build, and hair matched the photos on Rachel's flyer. On his tablet, the island still showed as having no listed permanent residents. Rachel insisted they take this straight back to Sheriff Davis. She did not know that how he handled Jake's report would change the direction of the case. Back inside the substation, Jake repeated his account in front of Sheriff Davis and Ben. He described the exact time of the flyover, the position of the villa on St. Aurelia Key, and the number of people he saw on the sand. He estimated the 2 women were in their early 20s. Their builds matched Emily and Sophie. On the conference table, Rachel spread out recent photos of her daughters. Jake pointed to each one without hesitation. Davis did not dismiss him outright. He asked a deputy to pull up land records and a Department of Natural Resources map. The island came up as privately owned by a limited partnership with addresses in Tampa and Miami. A short list of principal owners appeared. Several had daughters and nieces listed in previous charity coverage and local society pages. Davis highlighted those names and said it was much more likely Jake had seen family members or invited guests. Still, with Rachel and Ben watching, he agreed to a quick welfare check. 2 deputies were assigned to ride with Jake out to the island. Their body cameras, later reviewed by FDLE, show a short conversation at a dock with a property manager and 1 middle-aged owner. Several young women can be seen farther up the beach, turned away from the camera. None are asked for identification. No one is separated for a private interview. The visit lasts less than 20 minutes. When the group comes back, Davis tells Rachel they saw nothing to support Jake's suspicion. The owner, he says, was cooperative and annoyed. According to Davis, the women on the island were college-age relatives visiting for an early spring break. No one there recognized the names Emily or Sophie Miller. Davis notes in his log that lead appears negative and recommends focusing efforts elsewhere. Ben keeps his reaction to himself. Rachel leaves the station carrying an untouched stack of flyers. She starts posting them along Bay Ridge's small main street, then near a waterfront park. That is where an older man with sun-damaged skin stops, studies the photos for longer than most, and tells her he has seen those faces before. The man in the park said his name was Eli Walker. He kept his eyes on the posters as he spoke. He told Rachel he worked the water most days, running a small charter and fishing boat out of Bay Ridge. Then he said something that made her stop breathing for a moment. He was sure he had seen Emily and Sophie. Eli explained that a few months earlier, just after sunrise, he had been heading out past the channel markers. A white yacht had moved ahead of him, not fast, not slow. On its stern deck, he saw two young women about the same age as Rachel's daughters. One wore a Florida State sweatshirt despite the heat. The other sat close to the rail, guarded by a man in a collared shirt. The boat turned toward open water, then angled toward St. Aurelia Key. Rachel asked if he would tell this to Sheriff Davis. Eli shook his head and stepped back. He said he did not talk to Davis anymore. His father, James Walker, had died in state custody after a dispute over trespassing near the same island. Department of Corrections records later confirmed James had been assaulted by other inmates. Eli believed the original charge was pushed harder than it should have been. He blamed the island's owners and the local sheriff's office. He did, however, tell Rachel where to find him if she wanted more detail. He worked out of an old strip of docks north of town, known locally as Walker's Dock. Then he added one warning. Around here, he said, not everyone in uniform was on her side. That evening, back at the small motel Ben had arranged, Rachel looked up James Walker's name on her laptop. The dates and locations in the short obituary matched what Eli had said. The next morning, while Ben met again with Davis, she took a cab instead of waiting at the station. She gave the driver an address scribbled on the back of a flyer and watched the town fall away. At the end of the road, the pavement broke into cracked concrete and sand, and Rachel saw the weathered sign for Walker's Dock. Walker's Dock was a strip of aging wood and leaning sheds along a narrow channel. When Rachel stepped out of the cab, Eli was already there, repairing a net on an overturned crate. He did not seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded toward the water and asked if she still wanted the truth. They talked in the shade of his small storage shed. Eli filled in details he had skipped in the park. He gave a date for the yacht sighting. It was late September 2014, just after 6 a.m. His logbook, still on board, showed his own departure 10 minutes later. He repeated that one of the women on the yacht wore a Florida State sweatshirt. When Rachel opened her phone and scrolled through photos, he tapped on an image of Emily wearing the same maroon hoodie during a campus visit. Eli also mentioned something he had hesitated to say earlier. He believed the women on the yacht did not move like tourists. One sat very still. The man behind her kept a hand on the rail near her shoulder the entire time. Then the yacht turned away from open water and slipped behind the private channel that led towards St. Aurelia Key. Finally, Eli lifted a pair of marine binoculars from a hook on the shed wall. He walked Rachel around the back of the building to a low rise that overlooked the channel mouth. The sky was clear. Visibility was good. He told her to watch a gap between two distant markers and wait. 7 minutes passed. Then a white yacht appeared, matching his earlier description almost exactly. Through the binoculars, Rachel saw two women on the aft deck. One had dark hair pulled into a loose knot. The other rested both hands on the rail. Even at that distance, the posture, the height difference, the way one leaned toward the other, were familiar. Rachel said the names out loud without thinking. On that stretch of water, 8 months after the beach, she became convinced Emily and Sophie were still alive. The next decision she made would determine who found out first. Rachel's next call was not to the sheriff. Standing behind the shed at Walker's Dock, she called Jake Lawson first. She described the yacht, the deck layout, and the two women she believed were Emily and Sophie. On the other end, Jake was at a small airfield inland, near Bay Ridge. He stepped outside, looked toward the coast, and said he could see a white yacht on the horizon heading toward the mainland. The timing and direction matched what Rachel was seeing through the binoculars. Only then did she call Detective Ben Carter. She told him about Walker's dock, about Eli's story, and about James Walker's death after a trespassing charge near St. Aurelia Key. She explained what she had just seen on the water. Ben listened without interrupting. He had already been uneasy about how quickly Sheriff Davis had cleared the island. Now he had a pilot and a local fisherman both pointing at the same piece of water. He asked Rachel for her exact location and told her not to go anywhere near the substation. He would come to her. Phone records later show that on his way to Walker's dock, Ben called his supervisor at FDLE. He laid out a new concern, that local law enforcement in Bay Ridge might be compromised by ties to the island's owners. Campaign finance reports backed up part of that fear. The St. Aurelia Partnership and related companies had donated to Davis's last re-election. Within an hour, a federal task force contact was looped in. The case shifted on paper from a missing persons file to a potential trafficking and corruption investigation. At Walker's dock, Ben sat with Rachel in the marked car and opened a notebook. They mapped what each person knew. Jake could track the yacht from the air. Eli understood local channels and marinas. FDLE and federal agents could approach by land and see near Cedar Inlet Beach, where private boats often came in without much inspection. Ben decided that very little information would go back to Sheriff Davis before the operation. If the yacht suddenly turned around after any local call, they would know why. He told Rachel she could not be on the sand when they moved. She would watch from a rise above the inlet, close enough to see, far enough to stay off the radio traffic. For the first time since the beach, someone was planning around the idea that Emily and Sophie were alive and in the hands of people with power. By late afternoon, the plan moved from notes to action. At 5:12 p.m., Jake Lawson reported from the air that the white yacht had cleared the channel near St. Aurelia Key and was heading toward the mainland. Ben Carter drove Rachel to a sandy rise overlooking Cedar Inlet Beach, a spot used by locals to watch boats. He left her there with binoculars and a strict instruction to stay off the sand. Then he pulled away to meet his team and federal agents staging nearby. From her position, Rachel watched the shoreline and checked the time every few minutes. At 5:41 p.m., a black SUV rolled onto the beach access and stopped near the high tide line. Two uniformed deputies from Sheriff Davis's office stepped out and waited, facing the water. They were not part of any FDLE briefing. Just after 5:50 p.m., the yacht appeared offshore. A small dinghy was lowered and sent toward the beach with 4 men and 2 limp figures on board. Through the binoculars, Rachel saw that the 2 women were being held upright, their heads tipped forward. Their feet dragged as the men lifted them onto the sand. The deputies walked over. There was a short, tense exchange. One of the men handed each deputy a thick envelope. Both deputies slipped the envelopes into their jackets. What they did not see was Ben, parked higher up the access road, using his phone to record the transaction through his own long lens. At the same moment, Jake swung his seaplane into position offshore, cutting across the yacht's path as it started back toward deeper water. Federal agents in an unmarked boat accelerated in from the north, while an FDLE vessel moved in from the south. Radio logs later showed the word intercept called at 5:57 p.m. On the beach, the deputies froze when they saw the law enforcement boats closing. Ben drove straight down onto the sand, stepped out, and identified himself, ordering them to keep their hands visible. Offshore, agents boarded the yacht with weapons drawn, forcing the remaining crew to the deck. From her rise above the inlet, Rachel saw 2 women carried from the dinghy toward waiting medics and knew the next hours would confirm whether her belief was right or wrong. The 2 women on the beach were rushed to an ambulance staged near the access road. Medics noted shallow breathing, slow responses, and pinprick pupils. In the back of the unit, one of them stirred when a name was spoken. When a paramedic said, "Emily," her hand moved. Hospital intake forms from that night show both women were identified as Emily and Sophie Miller by fingerprints and dental records. Blood tests confirmed a sedative in their systems. It was a prescription drug sometimes used before minor procedures. The dose was high, but not lethal. Hospital staff kept them overnight for monitoring. FDLE officers were stationed at the door, while agents processed the yacht, the SUV, and the deputy's patrol car. On the sand, Ben Carter placed the two Bay Ridge deputies under arrest. The envelopes in their jackets held cash bundles matching serial numbers later tied to a safe on St. Aurelia Key. On the yacht, agents seized phones, laptops, a guest ledger, and a locked file box. Inside that box, they found travel documents, wire transfer records, and photographs of other young adults who were not on board. Some had been reported missing in other states. Some had never been reported at all. Within 48 hours, federal prosecutors filed a criminal complaint in the Northern District of Florida. The primary island owner, 2 associates, and 3 security staff were charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and transportation for unlawful purposes. The 2 deputies faced bribery, obstruction, and civil rights charges. Sheriff Tom Davis was placed on administrative leave pending an internal probe. Pre-trial hearings over the next months pulled more into the open. A former yacht crew member, already in custody on unrelated charges, agreed to cooperate. In sealed testimony, he described trips where young adults were brought to St. Aurelia Key, kept under watch, then moved through private airfields. Financial analysts traced payments from shell companies in Miami, Houston, and overseas. Emily and Sophie were not required to testify at the first hearings, but their names were on the witness list. As the case moved toward a full indictment and trial, one detail in the seized record suggested that St. Aurelia Key was only one stop in a longer chain. The federal case reached trial in late 2016 in Panama City's federal courthouse. A grand jury had returned a superseding indictment with more than 20 counts. The lead island owner, 2 business partners, and 3 security staff faced conspiracy, kidnapping, trafficking, and money laundering charges. The 2 Bay Ridge deputies were charged separately with bribery, obstruction, and civil rights violations. Before jurors ever heard a word, defense attorneys attacked the investigation. They filed motions to suppress evidence from the yacht search, claiming agents had no probable cause. They argued that Jake Lawson's aerial observations were unreliable and that Eli Walker was biased because of his father's death. A federal judge held 2 days of hearings. He ruled that the intercept was lawful, the recordings were admissible, and both men could testify, with their backgrounds fully disclosed to the jury. At trial, jurors saw body camera footage from the first welfare check on St. Aurelia Key. They watched deputies standing on the sand and accepting envelopes near the inlet. Financial analysts walked them through bank records tying shell companies to payments labeled as consulting and security retainers. A cooperating deputy, who had taken a plea, testified that these payments were bribes. He described instructions to leave island business alone and to log certain calls as resolved without actual checks. The most difficult testimony came from people who had been held on the island. Emily and Sophie gave statements by video from a secure room. They described being approached on Panama City Beach by 2 men who claimed to represent a nearby condo property. The men told them Rachel had arranged a surprise memorial dinner for their father at a private residence. Once in the car, the story changed. They were driven to a marina, put on a boat, and given pills to help with motion sickness. Their next clear memories were of a bedroom on St. Aurelia Key. They told the jury they were told to act as nieces and family friends. They were not allowed to leave without an escort. Their phones were taken. They had no access to money. When closing arguments ended 3 weeks later, jurors had to decide not only what happened to Emily and Sophie, but whether the island had been used the same way for others who never came home. The jury deliberated for 2 days in November 2016. When they came back, they returned guilty verdicts on nearly every major count. The lead island owner and 1 business partner were convicted of conspiracy, kidnapping, trafficking, and money laundering. The 3rd partner was acquitted on the trafficking charges, but found guilty of conspiracy and financial crimes. 2 security staff were convicted of kidnapping and unlawful transportation. In a separate trial, the Bay Ridge deputies were convicted of bribery, obstruction, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Sentencing hearings the following spring were long and detailed. Federal guidelines, victim impact statements, and financial loss calculations all played a role. The primary owner received a 40-year federal sentence with no parole. His closest partner received 35 years. The security staff members each received more than 20 years. 1 cooperating deputy received 12 years after testifying. The other, who continued to deny everything, received 20. Sheriff Tom Davis was never indicted on federal charges, but a state grand jury later found he had violated ethical rules. He resigned in 2017 and surrendered his law enforcement certification. The government seized St. Aurelia Key and related assets under forfeiture laws. In 2018, the property was sold to a conservation trust. The proceeds went into a fund for identified victims and their families. Financial records from the case also helped federal agents in other states re-examine missing adult cases with unusual travel or employment histories. Some were linked to the same network. Many were not. The full number of people moved through that island is still not clear. For Rachel, Emily, and Sophie, the aftermath did not look like a clean ending. They returned to Tallahassee, worked with trauma specialists, and rebuilt daily routines. Emily finished her degree, then shifted toward advocacy work for missing adults. Sophie left nursing for a job in victim services. Rachel spoke once at a congressional hearing on coastal corruption and private islands, then declined most media requests. She stayed in touch with Jake Lawson and Eli Walker, who both received formal commendations but still worked low-key jobs on the same stretch of coast. In 2020, investigators reviewing old financial ledgers from the case noticed several coded entries tied to other offshore properties that the court had never heard about.